This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. Nepal is at a serious crossroads. Over the last few months, we've seen a wave of truly shocking, high-profile arrests targeting some of the most powerful people in the country. Now, the headlines make it seem like the nation is finally cracking down on its deep-rooted corruption. But here's the big question. Is this a real breakthrough? Or is it just another round of political theater? A way to settle old scores? To really get what's happening today, we have to understand that corruption in Nepal isn't some new problem. No, it's more like a chronic illness. It's something that has plagued the nation for decades, and it's been seriously undermining its entire path to prosperity. Okay, take a look at this table from Transparency International. It really paints a clear picture. You see some minor ups and downs, but the big takeaway here is the stagnation. Nepal's rank has barely budged, going from 117th back in 2021 to 107th in 2024. That consistency, well, it shows a real lack of progress, keeping the country stuck firmly in what experts call the rampant corruption category. Just let that number sink in for a second. 107th out of 180. That places it among the most corrupt countries in the entire world. So yeah, the headlines might be new, but the problem they're talking about is very, very old and deeply entrenched. So what does this rampant corruption actually look like? Well, let's dig into 3 recent scandals that really give you an anatomy of a kleptocracy, a system where the political elite basically work together to plunder public resources on a scale that is just staggering. First up, the fake refugee scam. And this wasn't just about bribery, this was a deeply cynical plot. You had a criminal network, and we're talking a former deputy prime minister and a former home minister, who allegedly ripped off more than 800 of their own citizens. They sold them a completely false dream of being resettled in the U.S. as fake Bhutanese refugees, raking in millions of dollars and ending up with charges of treason for damaging the nation's reputation. Next, we have the widebody aircraft scandal. Buying 2 new jets for the national airline should have been a symbol of progress, right? Instead, it turned into a textbook case of graft. The deal was routed through this complex web of middlemen, bloating the price by at least $40 million and sinking the airline into billions of rupees of debt. The bribery was so obvious it even led to a conviction in the United States under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And finally, you have the endless gold smuggling scandals at Kathmandu's airport. In just one case, 60 kilograms of gold were seized, and that led to the arrest of a ruling party's vice chairman. Now, these cases don't just show corruption in customs, they also reveal how these anti-corruption investigations can be turned into political weapons in fights between coalition partners. Now, when you look at these cases side by side, a very clear pattern emerges. This isn't about isolated crimes. You've got senior figures from all the major political parties involved. This isn't a case of a few bad apples. It's a systemic rot that has absolutely shattered public trust in the country's democratic institutions. So, if these scandals are so blatant, you'd think the anti-corruption agencies would be the heroes here, right? Well, when we take a closer look at the very institutions designed to fight corruption, the picture gets even more troubling. At first glance, it looks like the main anti-corruption agency, the CIA, is really stepping up its game. In the last fiscal year, it filed 201 cases. That's double the number from the year before. On the surface, that sounds like pretty good progress. But then you see this chart, and the story completely changes. While the number of cases being filed has shot up, the conviction rate has absolutely plummeted. It's gone from a high of over 88% down to just 33%. This huge gap between activity and actual results, it points to a massive institutional failure. So why is this happening? Well, the CIA is basically compromised for a few key reasons. First, its leaders are political appointees, which creates an obvious conflict of interest. Second, there's a legal loophole that protects so-called policy decisions made by the cabinet from being investigated. This basically creates an immunity shield for the most powerful people. And finally, the agency has a history of focusing on catching small fish, minor bribery cases, while the big sharks behind the grand corruption get away. And, even if a case does make it to court, the problem is far from over. A landmark report from 2021, led by a former Chief Justice, no less, found that the judicial system itself is plagued by rampant corruption, with judges being appointed based on political influence. So the entire system, from the investigation to the final verdict, just seems to be a vicious circle of impunity. This deep-seated failure at home doesn't just stay at home. It carries a really heavy price tag on the international stage, and it directly impacts Nepal's economy, its reputation, and the daily lives of its people. Let's start with a key term, the Fat F Gray List. The Financial Action Task Force is basically the global watchdog for financial crime, and getting put on its gray list, well, that's a major red flag to the rest of the world. And in a huge development, Nepal was designated to be placed back on that gray list in February 2025 because it failed to tackle money laundering. This decision kicks off a whole cascade of negative effects. It makes every single international financial transaction more difficult, which threatens foreign investment. And critically, it threatens the flow of remittances from millions of Nepalese workers abroad, money that is an absolute lifeline for the economy. And look, the stakes just could not be higher. You've got international bodies like the World Bank saying it loud and clear. If Nepal doesn't tackle its corruption problem, its economic growth will stall. So the failure to reform at home is directly putting the country's entire future prosperity at risk. Okay, so this brings us back to where we started, to our final verdict. We began by asking if this crackdown is a real breakthrough or if it's just political theater. After looking at the scandals, the institutions, and the international fallout, what's the answer? While the evidence is pretty conflicting, on one hand, you have some reasons for cautious optimism. I mean, for the first time ever, some of the most powerful people in the country are actually facing justice, and that's being driven by immense public pressure. But on the other hand, the reasons to be skeptical are, well, they're overwhelming. The anti-corruption bodies and the courts are still compromised, and the legal system is still designed to protect the elite. So our verdict is this. What we're witnessing is a potential but extremely fragile breakthrough. These recent arrests have created a crack in a wall of impunity that honestly once seemed unbreakable. But the corrupt political and institutional structures that form the very foundation of that wall, they are still very much in place. And that brings us to the final critical question. The true measure of success here isn't going to be the number of arrests. The real test is what happens next. Will this moment be the catalyst for the deep, painful, and necessary reforms needed to make the anti-corruption bodies truly independent, to close those legal loopholes, and to clean up the judiciary? Will Nepal actually dismantle the system that allows corruption to thrive in the first place? The people of Nepal, and indeed the rest of the world, are watching.